I'm Gary with my friend Tom from Petoskey. We would like to share from Limits of Tyrants by Frederick Douglass. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are people who want crops without plowing up the ground.
Tom, please unmute.
Sorry, everybody, I forgot. They want ruin without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its waters.
This struggle may be a moral one, or maybe both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle.
Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will.
Find out what people will submit to, and you'll found out the exact amount of injustice which will be imposed on them.
The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress.
On June 26th, 2015, Bob and I were at the UUA General Assembly in Portland, Oregon. On that day, the Supreme Court handed down a decision legalizing gay marriage. A rainbow flag was unfurled from the podium, and all the gay couples were invited up to come up on stage for a standing ovation, and the cheers went on forever. Back home, we immediately started marrying gay couples. On June 24th, 2022, again at the GA in Portland, the Supreme Court handed down its decision on Dodd, overturning the 1973 ruling on Roe versus Wade. As you can imagine, the mood was quite different. When we got back home, we immediately started organizing to raise funds for women to travel out of state to get abortions if they needed to. The more we learned about this decision, and especially Clarence Thomas's opinion, the more we began to worry that other hard-won human rights are at risk. Access to birth control, gay marriage, to name only two. Underlying this court is a growing ideology of Christian nationalism. It seems as though this nation is in a Supreme Court argument of its own. It's Christian nationalism versus human rights. Christian nationalism, according to Sojourners magazine, is a growing political ideology that implies one must be Christian to be a true American, and that the growing presence of non-whites and non-Christians are a threat to traditional values. People who espouse this ideology believe real Americans are Christians who have a specific policy perspective. They feel the need to take back their country from those who they believe threaten it. It is isolationist in practice, and it is explicitly in the name of a particular religion. This Supreme Court decision and others that occurred in June as well bring into question the separation of church and state. Here are a couple of examples. One of the decisions was about a public high school football coach in Bremerton, Washington, who gathered with the players at the 50-yard line after a football game to pray. The school board tried to keep the 60-year separation precedent in place by arguing that the coach was in violation of the legal principle that school officials should not, either directly or indirectly, impose their religious views on students. What do you think? I remember when I was in high school, I pretty much thought of myself as an atheist. Now, I may have been rebellious enough and angry enough, I think, to not join in that prayer. But what would I have done instead? Leave the field? Stand in defiance, fist raised? I suppose I could plug my ears and go, na, 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 na. But the pressure would be on to comply. If you were a student on that football team, would you feel pressured to join the coach and other students as they prayed a very public Christian prayer? Bible study in a voluntary group after school is one thing, and that kind of off-schedule practice was encouraged in 1995 during the Clinton administration. A memorandum from that time said, nothing in the First Amendment converts our public schools into religion-free zones or requires all religious expression to be left at the door. The memo also said the right to engage in voluntary prayer or religious discussion free from discrimination does not include the right to have a captive audience listen to or compel other students to participate. Justice Sotomayor showed a picture of that prayer to show how very public and very compulsory it was. In another move, the court ruled that the state of Maine could not bar a religious school from receiving public grants and other non-religious public schools could get. Chief Justice Roberts said, that takes the separation of church and state just a little too far. I highlight these examples because they reveal overturning precedents for Christian complaints that Christians are being oppressed. And then there were other rulings too. There was the strength of the EPA to reduce carbon emissions was reduced, striking down a state's ability to restrict carrying a gun, and more. Elie Mystal said, in order to have rights in this country, under this conservative Supreme Court, you better be a cis hetero white man or an Uzi. In a discussion on the NPR program 1A, Andrew Whitehead, a professor of sociology, said that Christian nationalism is a cultural framework, meaning it is filled with symbols and narratives and traditions that dramatize certain values. And when it's in our cultural water, it becomes very powerful. We fail to see it. It becomes a given. Christian nationalists understand the world to be a chaotic place, and they're being led to believe that many rights they have enjoyed are being stripped away by newcomers or people who are not worth as much as they are, especially women and non-white people. They feel aggrieved. There are three major characteristics underlying this theology, according to Whitehead. There's a strong sense of moral traditionalism with a social hierarchy. Some people are worth more than others. There's comfort with authoritarian social control in what they see as a chaotic world. Violence may be needed to achieve that control. And they have a desire for strict boundaries around national identity, civic participation, and social belonging, often along racial lines. White, Christian, US born is the national identity. Everyone else is other. Religious liberty be damned. According to this ideology, religious liberty is defending their religious liberty, they think, is defending their access to power, privileged access to power. It brings privately held religious beliefs into the public square to restore Christian foundations so that everyone has to get in line. Why use religion or Christianity? Well, think about it. If God is on your side and the Bible and the Constitution are divinely inspired, which is what they say, where does that leave us humans? These are authorities granted by God. But we understand our authorities differently now, I hope. We have collectively shaped laws and practices. This is work we do. They are not handed down on stone tablets by God. There's a long history to this Christian nationalism. You know, our nation state was started by Europeans who believed they were here to discover and claim lands from the heathens, the doctrine of discovery. And this doctrine came from the Pope, the mouthpiece of God. It somehow twisted their moral understanding of what it means to be human or even Christian, that they could slaughter Indians and enslave Africans. So-called heathens were not fully human, were worth less than Europeans. Over time, we've changed our understanding of what it means to be human, thanks in part to a scientific understanding of the world, things like evolution, changing our understanding of God, and from where we draw our authority. But how do we explain the rise of Christian nationalism now that we are in this enlightened place? How do we explain it when we also know that organized religion is on the decline in the US? Conservative columnist Nate Hochman argues that there is no longer a humanizing Christian ethic at work on the right. So it's not your father's Christianity anymore. Instead, a white racial consciousness is filling the void the decline in organized religion has created. To retain and build power, the right has increased the culture wars in the hope that they can bring working and middle-class folks into a movement to gain power. But it is a dehumanizing approach built on fear and othering. By working against collective rulemaking, that is the government as we know it, they are fighting a battle they claim will protect people of all racial backgrounds, but especially working and middle-class people. They claim to be fighting the elite, which they define as scientific expertise and government officials. And don't even get me started on science, because that's a sermon for another time. They're doing an effective job of laying blame at liberal notions of government and all institutions for this chaotic and borderless world we supposedly live in, for all their grievances. We sure are seeing people expressing their love of Trump and illiberalism as divinely inspired. It is a frightening time. Do you remember when we used to worry about Sharia law? What a quaint fear. I remember George W. Bush bemoaning the extremists who hijacked a perfectly good religion. Columnist Zisham Aleem argues that Christian theocracy is not a far-off specter, but an emerging reality, fueled by a radically reactionary Supreme Court that is two-thirds Catholic. Thomas Jefferson's already dilapidated and graffitied wall of separation between church and state is crumbling. Dilapidated and graffitied wall of separation. The overturning of Roe v. Wade means the lives of women across this country are being held hostage by a conservative Christian conception of life. Not all faiths believe that life begins at conception. And at the state level, Republican-led legislatures have invoked Christianity as they pursue a systematic assault on transgender rights. The violence behind these efforts also uses Christianity as the justification for oppression and violence. The Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys are white supremacists who come from the roots of the KKK. They were all connected with a twisted, hijacked kind of Christianity using the symbol of the flag, the sword, and the Bible. They say we are a Christian nation, and they will use violent means if needed to gain power. And certainly on January 6th, people carried Bibles and flags and crosses and spears to the insurrection. Right-wing talk show host Andrew Torba is very explicit about what this movement is. He said, "We don't want people who are atheists. We don't want people who are Jewish, because this is an explicitly Christian movement, because this is an explicitly Christian country. You're free to stay here, right? You're not going to be forced to convert or anything, but you're going to enjoy the fruits of living in a Christian society under Christian laws." Congressional Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene proudly declares herself a Christian nationalist. And Representative Lauren Boebert said at a church in her home state, "I'm tired of the separation of church and state junk. That's not in the Constitution." She got a standing ovation. Human rights and the dilapidated, graffitied wall of separation have been, till now, moving progressively forward. It's taken a really long time. During the 1800 presidential election, John Adams was running against Thomas Jefferson. Can you imagine? Both Unitarians. But Adams supported the church establishment in Massachusetts, and Jefferson fought for church-state separation in Virginia. According to the late Reverend Forrest Church, Adams' stand made him more attractive to those who believed that a Christian nation should have only Christian leaders. Jefferson argued that it didn't matter what one's religious beliefs were. He felt religious freedom would be at risk under Adams. Now, this contest occurred shortly after the Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791. I know you know this history, but I think it bears pointing out that there were mistakes in the original Constitution. Perhaps it wasn't so divinely written after all. And the founders tried to rectify those mistakes with the Bill of Rights. The very first amendment in the Bill of Rights was this: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That amendment goes on to include speech, press, assembly, and the right to file a grievance against the government. But what the founders thought was missing in the Constitution first off was freedom of religion. That's huge. But, you know, Boebert is right. That does not say there's a wall of separation. But the Baptist Association of Danbury, Connecticut, wrote to Jefferson in 1801 during his first term in office. The Baptists were advocating for religious liberty. They wrote, "Our sentiments are uniformly on the side of religious liberty, that religion is at all times and places a matter between God and individuals, that no man ought to suffer in name, person, or effects on account of his religious opinions, and that the legitimate power of civil government extends no further than to punish the man who works ill to his neighbor." They argued that the Constitution is not quite specific enough and wanted to offer Jefferson the encouragement to hold fast to the separation in spite of pressure from others. Well, Jefferson upheld the First Amendment, especially the part that read the government should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It was in a letter of response to the Baptists that Jefferson said that this amendment builds a wall of separation between church and state. So no, the wall of separation is not language that is explicitly in the Constitution, but clearly separating religion from government is in the First Amendment. It was that important. UUs have long ago moved away from Christian theology, but we have many Christian siblings working against this Christian nationalism. Is it right to use religion as an organizing political force? Christianity has been a significant driving force behind the civil rights movement, especially the Black church. This political and religious entanglement was intended to inspire and organize for liberation, not oppression. So there's the Christianity that calls for us to love thy neighbor, and there's the Christianity that continues to narrow who can be included in our democracy and who is other. The Black church during the civil rights era was clearly the love thy neighbor type. And the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called on us to live up to our Constitution and Declaration of Independence, not to tear it down. According to Henry Louis Gates Jr. from the PBS special on the Black church, the Black church was the cultural cauldron that Black people created to combat a system designed to crush their spirit. Collectively and with enormous effort, they refused to allow that to happen. And the culture they created was sublime, awesome, majestic, lofty, glorious, and at all points subversive of the larger culture of enslavement that sought to destroy their humanity. The miracle of African American survival can be traced directly to the miraculous ways that their ancestors reinvented the religion that their masters thought would keep them subservient. Rather, that religion enabled them and their descendants to learn, to grow, to develop, to interpret and reinvent the world in which they were trapped. It enabled them to bide their time, ultimately, time for them to fight for their freedom and for us to continue to fight for our own. Well, how do you stand over and against an increasingly powerful Christian nationalism that seems to be pulling our country in the wrong direction and clearly backward? Our principles call us to work toward compassion and justice and toward interdependence, not toward isolation and oppression, not toward segregation, and not for the dignity of the few who look or think a certain way. We use our faith as a guide for our politics, as does the Black Church and other Christians and other faiths. UUism is not a religion established by the state. There should be none. And we are constitutionally allowed to exercise whatever religion we want, or none. Thus, the state should not stand in our way of exercising our religious understanding of when life begins, on what gender and sexual orientation means, and how to live freely in diverse, multicultural, and multi-faith communities. It also means that all people in this country, not just white landowning men, are needed for democracy to work as it was envisioned. So when Christian nationalism is moving toward an authoritarian leader who is looking out for the ideals that we did not negotiate democratically, we are moving toward tyranny. Our country is changing. We are increasingly multicultural, and that requires greater inclusive tendencies, not greater oppressive approaches. People of faith who believe in liberal institutions and the strength of government and science, flawed as they all are, need to organize like never before to reverse these trends toward Christian nationalism. Instead of moral traditionalism and social hierarchy, celebrate new ideas that will move us toward equity and inclusion. Instead of violent authoritarian social control, be uncomfortable with messy democracy. Recognize the world has always been an uncertain place. Violence is not the answer. Beloved community is. And instead of strict boundaries around identity and belonging, recognize that the way to peace is with broad civic participation and the development of social interconnectedness. I went to a community organizer training last month in Minnesota. The group there, called Isaiah, has been working for over 25 years for justice and equity. Michigan has a similar group called Michigan Faith in Action. Isaiah has two guiding visions for a multiracial democracy and a caring economy. Multiracial democracy and an economy built on care. These visions turn Christian nationalism upside down by getting everyone to vote and by building our economy for people rather than for corporate profit. As Frederick Douglass said, we cannot submit to injustice. So these are the kinds of things that I can work for. If you're worried about the Supreme Court, I am too. But I take some comfort from the late Howard Zinn, who wrote an article in 2005. He argued that human rights have never been won by sitting back and waiting for the courts to make a decision. They came from the grassroots agitation of a great majority of people to insist on rights, rights the Supreme Court cannot take away. It doesn't feel that way in 2022, but civic action matters. Look at Kansas in response to Roe. Zinn wrote, knowing the nature of the political and judicial system in this country, its inherent bias against the poor, against people of color, against dissidents, we cannot become dependent on the courts or on our political leadership. They deflect us from the most important job citizens have, which is to bring democracy alive by organizing, protesting, engaging in acts of civil disobedience that shake up the system. Let us not be disconsolate over the increasing control of the court system by the right wing, he wrote in 2005. The courts have never been on the side of justice, only moving a few degrees one way or the other, unless pushed by the people. Fundamental change will depend on the actions of an aroused citizenry, demanding that the promise of the Declaration of Independence, an equal right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, be fulfilled. As Thich Nhat Hanh said in the recording used in the service at the Petoskey congregation last week, Hanh said, we need to learn to transform anger and fear and despair. We can't change the world without changing our thinking, and we do that collectively and in our congregations and in dialogue, not in violence. Our task is to come together to produce that collective awakening. From communities of resistance that counteract consumerism and individualism, we need to build community and solidarity. We need to pay attention. We need to work peacefully for more love, and we need to do it with urgency. We need to start today. So let our UU communities offer a culture that is sublime, awesome, majestic, lofty, glorious, and at all points subversive of the larger culture. And we need to include the awe along with the anger. We need to act. We shall overcome. May it be so. May we make it so. Amen.